Welcome to the Recovery 2.0 conference. I'm your host, Tommy Rosen, and today I'm so excited to be speaking with Kari Kwinn. Kari Kwinn is a yoga teacher and writer and director of journeys at Recovery 2.0. This means she runs all of our live retreats and gets to connect with a lot of Recovery 2.0 members. Kari describes herself as having both a black belt and a gold medal in codependency. Now firmly in her recovery, she shares her forthcoming book, Not About Me, a Memoir, which recounts her personal journey into and out of a relationship with an active sex addict. Combining her backgrounds in yoga and medical anthropology, Kari offers her personal perspective into better understanding the nuances of healthy relationship. Kari, thank you so much for sharing your presence and wisdom with the Recovery 2.0 conference. Welcome.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm very excited to be here.
So awesome. Well, Kari, we were having a conversation I can't remember exactly when it was, but you said a few things to me which were so profoundly important and also unspoken. And by unspoken, I mean rarely are these topics covered, not even within the Recovery 2.0 conferences. We haven't found anyone. We found very few people who are actually experts in sex addiction. And of course, even fewer people who are on the codependent side of that relationship. So this is a very, very important interview. And we could begin with just a little bit about how you view, codependency, how you see your arc from addiction into healing and recovery.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I have found that I used to refer to myself as an addict without a vice. And it wasn't until I started, I think, in my work in the world of recovery that I really understood the extent to which I had experienced codependency as an addiction, as sort of that underlying addiction to everything, every other aspect. And that was the part that I really identified with. So even though I wasn't necessarily engaging in those other kinds of behaviors, I recognized something in myself. Mike, I think that many of us experience codependency, and I like the idea of talking about codependency as having inappropriate boundaries. You know, me letting you in more in than I should, or letting me more out than I should, or some combination of those two things, or in my case, all of the above. I think I really explored all the edges of boundaries in different areas. And as it relates to sex addiction, I think you're also very right. It's something that we don't talk about. And I believe that codependency, as it relates to sex addiction, is a particularly unique expression. So I think many people who experience codependency, and I've had the privilege of participating in some 12-step work, just general 12-step work as it relates to alcohol and drug addiction, codependency and related to those items. That is sort of like, I want to control, I want to help. Like you see somebody and you want to help them. You're like, oh man, this person is really struggling. They don't have enough energy to do what they need to do. So I'm going to devote some of my life force, some of my energy to helping them do the thing that they need to do so that they can stop drinking, stop using drugs, whatever that might be. I recently, as you saw, I recently performed stand-up comedy, and my joke about codependency was, for me, codependency is me flushing your drugs down the toilet and then needles in your lunch pail, just in case. It's sort of the extremes where it's like, I don't want you to do this thing. I know you don't have the power to do it on your own, so I'm going to help by getting rid of your drugs. But just in case you decide that that's something you need to do, I'm going to make sure that you can do it as safely as possible. And both of those are, like, one is controlling and the other one is manipulative and whatever that might be.
Well, I just will simply say that in exactly what you've just detailed as basic ideas around codependency, for myself, I completely, utterly relate to both the control piece and the manipulation piece. And I also really appreciate that you look at codependency as an aspect of addiction that underlies other aspects of addiction, that it seems to be there first. It's a really important idea.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the way you asked, the way that it relates to sex addiction is particularly unique because I could be very jealous or envious of your relationship with a drug or with alcohol, right? I could say, I can't believe that you're drinking instead of spending time with me, or how could you choose heroin over your children? And I could have feelings about that, and I could take that personally. In the realm of sex addiction, my primary partner, if I'm a committed monogamous kind of a person, if I'm a committed monogamous kind of person, my partner is engaging in a behavior that is also a betrayal of that that personal relationship.
Mm.
And that asks me, or as somebody who struggles with codependency, that has me affect my own body by either engaging in behaviors that I wouldn't otherwise engage in terms of like, I'm going to try to meet a need that you're trying to meet elsewhere. And so if I can become that need for you, I can do that, or change my body to be more appealing to you. I will take it personally and say, I'm not good enough, so I need to be more attractive in whatever that way is. And so there's a way of self-harming and a real drain on self-worth that is also associated as sort of an added layer on top of the codependency.
Thank you so much. From an anthropological perspective, can we just take a step back and look at sex addiction and sort of the varying degrees that we see it in our society? And if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think this is one area that I found I was particularly vulnerable because I'm a medical anthropologist and I've worked in reproductive health for a long time. And so I'm very familiar and very comfortable with a wide range of normal, healthy sexual behavior. So I understand that there are people who participate in different kinds of behaviors that some people might like or might not like, might consider deviant, might consider preferences. And that is distinct from sex addiction. Sex addiction, in my understanding, and I will say I'm not an expert in sex addiction. I'm an expert in recovery from codependency with a sex addict. But my understanding from speaking with many sex addicts in recovery and otherwise is that there's a compulsivity to the behavior. So rather than saying there's a deviance in the behavior, there's a compulsivity in the behavior. So what might be considered a normal behavior or something that wouldn't necessarily incite shame in one person, if that person is compulsively thinking about it over and over and over and cannot help themselves from engaging in that behavior, they will experience that shame. And to me, that is what crosses it into that. So it doesn't actually matter what the behavior is. We get really caught up on what the behavior is. My big fear, and I think one of the reasons that people in relationship with active sex addicts or sex addicts in recovery is that we out that person. We out the person we're in relationship with, because you can go to an Al-Anon meeting and be like, there's an alcoholic in my life. It could be my coworker, it could be my brother, it could be my mom, it could be my child. When you are when you're saying I'm in relationship with a sex addict, it's pretty obvious who you're talking about. And so
the people who know you.
Isolated, and our shame comes from that. And then I think we were also asking, is that there are the sort of different layers of sex addiction? Is that more of
what you just said is brilliant. It helps me think. I love the difference between, what one might consider, deviance or not, and, just the compulsive aspect of it. That's very important. It actually cuts across all addictions, that feeling. So that I do this behavior and I feel shame afterward from doing it. Whereas someone else might do that behavior and not feel that shame at all. They're free from it. It's not a compulsion or an addiction for them. But I get that. That's really important. I also know that, sex addiction is sort of the final frontier, if you will. Nobody wants to talk about it. There's a tremendous amount of shame and, of course, misunderstanding around what it is. And anybody in society, if you say the word sex addict, like certain images are going to come into a person's head, which may or may not be at all what we're talking about. So we should probably get down to degrees and sort of look at some of the grays instead of looking at this as a black and white issue.
Sure. So I think there's a very influential person in the world of sex addiction. Patrick Carnes has written several books and does a lot of work in the world of sex addiction. And he describes sort of 3 different layers of behavior that are potentially problematic. The first one is sort of what we would consider to be socially acceptable kinds of things. Someone who might compulsively watch porn or compulsively go to strip clubs or even compulsively engage in erotic massages or something that we're sort of like, it's on the fringe of like everyone's, it's like we wouldn't necessarily talk about it, but you could, like, there could be people who are like, yes, I go to strip clubs and I enjoy it. Yes, I watch porn and I enjoy it. And there could be people who are having a compulsive experience with those things. And that's sort of the distinction, but that's sort of that first layer. And then the second layer is something where it's maybe socially troublesome. So someone being an exhibitionist or a voyeur or sort of like groping someone on the subway or something like that, just kind of like, it's not legal, but also if you call the cops and you're like, hey, this is what's happening, they're kind of like, you're not a big priority right now. So there's a sort of second level. And again, it's the compulsivity of that behavior. And then that third layer is the part that's really problematic. That is sexual assault, that is incest, that is molestation, that is really an egregious crime. And I think the challenge is that many of us, when we hear the term sex addiction, we go straight there. We're like, oh, well, you must be a pedophile. You must be a rapist. And the reality is that there are the vast majority of people who struggle with compulsive sexual behavior aren't in that category. And not everyone who engages in those kinds of behaviors that we would generally agree across cultures are taboo, and not even just taboo, but completely inappropriate. Not all of those people are sex addicts. Not all of those people are engaging in that behavior in a compulsive way.
I understand.
Right?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And I would hope that the people that are watching this begin to have this expanded perspective on sex addiction based upon those 3 categories of Patrick Carnes, that you're passing on so well. But I want to speak to you now about the personal side of things. You've been through relationships, a number of relationships that I think you would term as codependent, although also quite loving in many ways. And that's something that doesn't really get spoken about. And I'm wondering if you can sort of help us to understand that everyone might be on some level on the spectrum of codependency in a relationship, but that doesn't mean that it's not a beautiful relationship and that there's not room for growth, but there's also a lot of love there. Can you speak to that? Because that might shed some light on some things.
Yeah, I think it's a really important concept because the trouble with loving an addict is that they're people. Like, addicts are people. Addicts aren't a kind of person. I had this idea that addicts are a kind of person, and I'm not that kind of person. I am that kind of we're all that kind of person. I believe addiction to be part of the repertoire of all humans. We're all capable of engaging in behaviors to escape from our current experience of pain or dissociate from whatever that is. And so we all have that capacity within us. And I think most of us express that through some level of codependency. And that might be doing something for someone that they could do for themselves. That might be, or that might be, not letting anyone in at all. It's sort of like the difference between picking someone up and carrying them around and being like, I've got you, everything, like, you are my like, I will take care of all of your needs like you would an infant. That's appropriate when the other person is an infant. It's not appropriate when the person isn't an infant. And we all do some of that sometimes, especially I think when we're under distress. Some of us, when we feel like, oh, I'm kind of, I'm in a stressed out moment in my life, there's too much going on at work, I'm going to start to try to control what I can. And that might be the people closest to me in my life. That might be my partner, that might be my child, that might be my parent, whoever that is. Like, codependency can exist in any and all relationships. Or we might go to the other extreme, which is showing up with a machine gun and just being like, I don't engage with other people right now. There's a brick wall here. There's barbed wire at the top. There are guards at the top. There's no one getting in. I'm struggling, and my way of dealing with struggling is to shut you out completely.
Mm.
And so I think we do all of that. I think it's unfortunate that we might classify people and say, well, you tend towards this behavior and you tend towards that. It's good. It's good for us to know, like, oh, look at me. How adorable am I right now? I'm putting up walls. How adorable am I? I just picked you up and carried you around the house. You know, and that's sort of a tactic that I've used in my recovery, is to not be like, well, I guess I'm screwed up. Guess that's it. But to be like, how adorable of me right now. I just did something for someone that I didn't need to do. I just asked for something I didn't need to ask for. I just changed the way I responded to this person because I was afraid about how they were going to receive my response.
Yes. Well, what you're speaking to is a process of ever greater awareness. And so would you say that is a part and parcel of the beginning, at least, if not the process of healing from codependency, is first of all catching it, of course, but what has been your process for moving into greater awareness and ultimately getting to change your behavior?
I think several different things. I always relate that awareness. I've taught yoga for a very long time, and I've always struggled with concepts like mindfulness. I'm like, I don't know what is cultivating mind. I don't know what that is. To me, mindfulness is realizing sooner. So for me, I use the Pringles, like the can of Pringles, right? Mindfulness is realizing you're elbow deep in a can of Pringles before you finish the can. Oh my God, there's 3 chips left, and I don't have to eat them. I could. I'm being mindful. Now I'm aware of where I am. And so the next time you're like halfway through the can, and the next time it's not all the way, and then the next time is when you're taking it off the shelf, and the next time is when you're at the grocery store. And mindfulness is being aware where you are so that you can catch yourself in that pattern or cycle of behavior just like 1 millimeter sooner. My recovery has been 1 millimeter at a time. Because unlike other kinds of addictions, you can't put down relationships with other people. I cannot survive in this world as a cultural being without engaging with other humans.
Yes.
So I get to practice that and cultivate that mindfulness and awareness. I also tell other people what I'm working on. So if I notice something and I notice that, like, oh, I always modify my texts to this person so that, because I don't want to offend them. I'll just spell it out in the text. Like, I'm a little bit afraid of offending you. Here's what I actually want to say. Can we have a meta conversation about this? Or I'll do do-overs. Like, I have a very good friend who has encouraged me to do do-overs. When I have a codependent conversation, or I have a conversation that doesn't go the way I want to, I pick up the phone again and I'm like, hey, here's the deal. Like, that didn't go the way I wanted to. Can we try that again?
That's amazing. I love that. I want a do-over of many, many things.
Well, and I think that we can do that. Like, if we can embrace that we're imperfect beings and that we're doing better and we're doing our best, I personally would rather get that phone call from someone who's like, oh, I feel like I didn't do that the way I wanted to. Could you give me another chance?
Yes.
Do that differently?
Can you, thank you. Can you speak now to the person who is in relationship right now with a sex addict, or someone who is in relationship with somebody where the relationship is asking something of them that they're uncomfortable to give, but they're still trying to give it anyway? Tell me about that person. What are they experiencing? Who are they?
I think my experience, and I've certainly had a lot of conversations. I'm very fortunate in some ways, in that at the end of my relationship with the sex addict, he generally announced that what he was struggling with. And so then it became public knowledge what I was struggling with. And I had felt like I needed to guard and protect. And I think that's one of the biggest things about a codependency, whether it's with a sex addict or someone else, is like the need to guard and protect someone else's reputation, which is, by its very nature, my own pride to protect my own reputation. but it doesn't feel like that. It feels like I'm here to protect them, but I'm really protecting me, but I'm protecting them. So because of that, many, many people have approached me privately and saying, me too, me too, me too, me too. I'm in that circumstance. I'm in that situation. I think I'm in that situation. Can you help me understand if I'm in that situation? And I'm not a mental health professional. You know, I always refer people to speak to a mental health professional. But yes, I think it is much more common than we expect that someone feels the need and desire to isolate and live a double life. And that double life is around someone else's behavior. So the double life is I'm here to protect someone else's reputation. And so out there, I'm one person, but privately by myself, I'm a completely different person. And I'm really struggling with this.
Yes. And because of that stance, you're unable, you're literally stuck, unable to share with or to get help from anybody.
Exactly. Well, you feel like you are. You feel like no one knows what I'm going through. No one is experiencing what I'm going through. And I'm here to tell you, no matter who you are or what you're doing or what you're experiencing, you are not the only person. It is a much more common experience, and the details don't matter as much, but there is that shared experience of saying, I am feeling like I need to protect someone, and at that same time, I'm feeling like I need to break down my own sense of self and engage in behaviors that I would not otherwise have behaved in or engaged in. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
So like, in some ways, there's a healthy relationship, and I'm going to use non-sexual examples. So you're in a healthy relationship with someone, and your partner says, you know what? I'd like to try horseback riding. And you're like, okay, let's try that. Why not? Or maybe like, I'm not super excited about horseback riding. I don't really love horses, but I'll give it a try. You're not really compromising your own sense of self and your own values to do that. If your partner then says, you know what I really would like to do? I'd love to go skydiving. I'd love to go free diving, so you're like way under, it feels like a riskier behavior. And now you're starting to compromise your own sense of self to be like, I'm actually terrified of flying. I'm terrified of the idea of jumping out of a plane, but I love you and I feel like maybe I should because you're my person and I've made a commitment to you in one way or another. And so I guess I'll get in the plane. I guess I'll try free diving. And it's just not being authentic to yourself, and it's not being authentic to them either.
Yes.
That
Oh, absolutely. One thing I'm thinking about is that from the side of the addict, a person who's experienced addiction in a variety of forms, and I'll speak about relationships. One of the things I recognize about my ego self, and by that I mean the part of my ego, not all my ego, because some of that is going to be good and important, but the ego part of me that is out of control or that demands for itself what it wants whenever it wants it. I know that addiction is closely related to that part of ego self. There's an absolute demand or a need that ego's needs be met. So I know from the many relationships that I've had, and again, such beautiful relationships, so filled with love and care and affection, as well as some of the challenges that come with codependency. But I know for me that there's no human being that could meet the needs of my ego. There's no human being. So to be in relationship at that time with someone who's not, I would just call myself, at that time I was still fractured and fractured psyche in some way. So to be in relationship with someone who's fractured in that way is to continually put yourself at the mercy of the whims and the needs of that person's ego. So if the person's thing is drugs, that's going to look a certain kind of way. If their thing is sex, they're going to come looking for you to meet every imaginable whim that they would have sexually, which is just coming from this unhealed, fractured part of themselves. Does this make some sense?
Yeah.
So, and so what the point of what I'm trying to say is that as somebody who has been in relationship with a sex addict, and for the people who can resonate with your experience, I imagine what it feels like is you just can't ever be enough.
Absolutely. And that is the lesson, is that you try to fold and shape yourself either physically or behaviorally into a fantasy. The reality is that the goal of all addicts is a fantasy. It is unachievable, right? There is never enough alcohol. There's never enough drug. There's never enough whatever the sexual behavior or interest is. Like, it will continue to escalate. That is the very nature of addiction.
Yes.
And so when you create, you have become, in some ways, for some people, the object of that addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, you will never be enough. And so many of us, I think it's a pervasive thought in our culture. I'm not good enough. I'm not tall enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not whatever enough. I'm not young. You know, all of the I'm not enoughs that boil down to I'm not enough. Like, if we had that sort of undercurrent of what is playing in the background station of America right now, it is I'm not enough. And then you get this, the person closest to you in your life, the person with whom you share a very intimate side of yourself, who is telling you in that same way over and over again, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, you are not enough. That message is right for you. And
yes.
And it has nothing to do with how being vulnerable to this has nothing to do with how good you are, how smart you are, how pretty you are, any of that. Any of that. It is simply that you have landed in relationship with someone who is trying so desperately to fill a hole that can't be filled. And they are trying to fill that with you or with people that compete with your interests or whatever that might be.
I have to imagine that on the sex addict side of things, there's a lot of cheating or sleeping around, which would just go hand in hand with that kind of an addiction. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, so I think there's a whole range, and it is possible to have a very detrimental sex addiction without engaging with other people, right? It's possible to engage with porn or voyeurism or some of those other kinds of behaviors without having sexual contact with other people. But I do think that it's a very common experience also for people to have sexual contact with other people, that because their primary partner isn't enough, can never be enough, they will act out, and they will act out with partners that might be, professionals, people who are professional sex workers, or anonymous sorts of ways, or in some ways, if they are also dealing with a little bit of that sort of love addiction thing, like chronic affairs or those kinds of things. But certainly there's a wide range of risk behavior that can happen in active sex addiction.
Thank you. Speaking about the way out, so is it possible for a relationship to heal where one person is dealing with sex addiction and the other person, is dealing with being with a sex addict?
I have to believe that that's possible. I have to believe that, well, my personal perspective and seeing, I participate in some groups with, there are various groups, there's 12-step groups, there are, therapeutic groups, people in relationship with active sex addicts and sex addicts in recovery, that a lot of the people in those groups are in relationship with people in recovery from sex addiction. I don't know that it's possible to recover if you are in relationship with an active addict in this way.
Active being the operative word there.
Active being the operative word.
Meaning they're not in recovery.
They're not in recovery. They're not seeking recovery. They are experiencing whatever way of bypassing that. So either denying that they have an addiction, justifying their behavior as normal, all the kinds of same ways that any addict might not be willing to see the truth about themselves. I believe that people in active addiction have no relationship with the truth. They can't possibly have a relationship with the truth. And I don't know that it's possible to have a relationship with someone who doesn't have a relationship with the truth within themselves.
Thank you so much. And so when it doesn't work out, when one person is in a relationship with someone else who, for whatever reason, in whatever way, they just decide that they're not going to face this, they're not going to deal with it, and you're in a relationship with someone that you love, as you said, these are just people. What's the way out there? What advice can we offer for somebody who's in such a relationship and their partner just refuses to try to recover from this thing?
I think it's incredibly challenging, and it is the highest work of boundary, of understanding who you are and your sense of self-worth and what that means. And that might mean that you don't engage in a physical relationship with that person. That might mean that in order to protect yourself, that you need to have different kinds of physical boundaries that maybe don't include sex or don't include any of that sort of intimacy. And then that's the negotiation that you have. Is the relationship that I have with this person fulfilling to me? Is it nourishing and nurturing to me? And am I willing to live in without this aspect of myself? And that's a hard question to answer. And I know that there are people, women and men, and I will say there are men on this side of the equation as well. There are women who are sex addicts, and there are men who are in relationship with women with sex addiction as well. So while it tends to be sort of gender skewed, or the way that we've been representing it as gender skewed, I don't know that that's appropriate. I think that it comes down to, how do I feel safe? Can I feel safe in this relationship? And that's true for everyone. If you can't feel safe in your relationship, it's not a relationship. You have to get to a place where you feel safe. And so that might be physical boundaries, it might be emotional boundaries, it might be other kinds of boundaries. And I think that is how people in recovery, both people in recovery from sex addiction and people in recovery from codependency with sex addiction, navigate, as they start to speak very clearly about boundaries in a way that I think we could actually all benefit from. I think it would be really lovely if we could all talk about physical, like, what are my physical boundaries? Just because I'm married to you doesn't mean I get to touch your body whenever I want to, however I want to. We get to talk about those kinds of things. Just because we're married doesn't mean that you call, I answer. Like, we get to negotiate that and have that conversation. And so in some ways, I found that the recovery process has supported me in all of my relationships going forwards, because I'm able to speak about these different kinds of boundaries and negotiate them and have that meta conversation.
I love it. That sounds like real healing. It's amazing. Good job. Yeah. Well, on our retreats, we've had the benefit of seeing a few couples, if you remember, come on retreat with us, who are in recovery together as a couple from one or the other being in sex addiction. And there I've seen tremendous hope and tremendous healing and possibility. Could you comment on that coming back together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the work that we can all benefit from. And if two people have in mind that their goal is for this relationship to work, I think that they can do that. And I think that they can overcome tremendous betrayal and obstacle and challenge by having that willingness to have that conversation and to continue to have those conversations. To me, that's what recovery looks like. That's what recovery from codependency looks like. That's what recovery from sex addiction looks like, is that constant vigilance in that relationship, in terms of, am I getting what I need? Are there needs that could be met by someone else? It has us do a lot, of course, like any recovery, of our own introspection. Who am I bringing to the table? Who are you bringing to the table? How are we going to navigate this together? And I think that anyone who says, I'm committed to making this work, can make it work. I really do. I mean, we've seen the same couples. Like, I've heard some amazing stories of recovery, and that is incredibly hopeful for me, because I did at the end of my relationship I felt like I literally had zero self-worth. I was like, well, I'm never going to be marriageable. Nobody is ever ever going to be interested in me again. And that's not the truth.
Hmm.
And
Yes. Well, Kari, I'm so grateful to you for this conversation and for, your willingness to speak so openly about it. It's the first time, as I said, that we've ever covered this topic, and I'm hoping if you're watching this that you're going to be changed by hearing this perspective out loud. And Kari, when can we expect your book?
I've finished writing the book, and I am pursuing publication right now.
Yes. Yes.
So we can expect it in the future.
Yes, that's good. As a friend of mine likes to say, "Oh, you can expect it anytime you want."
That's right. That's right. It's out of my head, so that's great, and it's in the process, and it's in progress, and it describes the various relationships in my life. This was not the first addict that I was in relationship with, and how my previous experiences set me up to stay in a relationship with an active addict, despite everything that I know, and then how I moved beyond that.
Well, thank you for sharing your story of healing. And I know that people are going to want to read that book. Me at the top of that list. I know what an extraordinary writer you are and communicator and considerate and thoughtful person. So let's put our minds together and get that done quickly. Okay. Any final words that you'd like to offer to folks who find themselves in a dire predicament?
Yeah, I think you often say that shame is addiction's favorite food. And I think the tendency to isolate and feel like the only person in the world is the thing that keeps us from seeking the help that we need. And I think that everyone on a path of recovery, everyone that's watching and listening to this, I would hope that they would view sex addiction differently, that they would view codependency with sex addiction differently. I think that there is a stigma and there is a judgment that well, I'm screwed up because I used this, but you're screwed way more. You're worse than I am because of this. There's a value judgment associated with it, which I think is really unfortunate and keeps a lot of people in secrecy and in shame and in isolation. And so we can work together as a community and lift one another up. And if someone says to you, I think I'm in relationship with someone in active sex addiction, you're like, why are you staying? Why? Just get out of there. Just get out. That'll do it. That does not feel like a leg up. I say, wow, I've heard about that. That must be hard. I don't know if there's a way that I can help. If there's a way that I can help, or if there's a way that someone could help, I will encourage you to connect and keep connecting.
What's the name of the 12-step program for people in relationships with sex addicts?
There's one called COSA, which is Codependence of Sex Addiction, COSA. And they have meetings, and there are quite a few certified sex addiction therapists, CSATs, who work both with people in recovery from sex addiction and people in recovery from codependency with sex addiction, whether they're in an active relationship with an addict in recovery or active or not. And I think that this is another really important takeaway for those people who find difficulty finding community. Many of us seek out therapy as help. We think we feel crazy. And the wrong therapist, a therapist who isn't familiar with addiction and isn't familiar with sex addiction, a very well-meaning and thoughtful therapist who deals with relationship can actually add trauma to the experience because they don't understand the compulsive nature of the behavior. So if the behavior in question is, well, my partner really wants to have sex with their socks on, whatever it is, you substitute in the behavior. I'm not excited about that. Someone who is not in a compulsive sexual kind of experience, the therapist might rightly say, well, partner, let's talk about why that doesn't work for you. See if we can make some changes and make that okay for you. Like, that's an okay request. Let's talk about why that's not an okay request. And if somebody is actually engaging in active addiction, that is like the worst thing that you can hear, to be like, oh, it is my fault. The culture says I'm not enough. That person says enough. I'm not enough. And now that therapist agrees that it's all my fault.
Right. So that can be interpreted like that. I get it.
It could be received that way if the therapist doesn't understand the full context of what's happening. And they could be a very good therapist for people in a healthy relationship, for people struggling with sort of non-addictive relationship concerns.
Yes.
But working with someone who is specifically trained in sex addiction is key to not adding fuel to the fire of that trauma and that self-immolation that happens.
Kari,
Yes.
Thank you so much for your thoughtfulness and your wisdom and sharing your experience so openly. I'm so grateful for you and to you. And I know people are going to want to know more. So when this book comes out and other things happen for you as a teacher, I know they're going to come looking for you, and we'll be encouraging that. So thank you so much. Much love and gratitude for you.
Thank you, Tommy.
Okay. Bye, Kari.